Hello viewers. So as already stated, we are discussing different theories of error as stated, as propounded, as explained in several texts of classical Indian philosophy. Once again, before we start our discussion on some of the new theories, some of the new kinds of explanations regarding erroneous cognition that we find in several texts, in different texts of classical Indian philosophy, let's again before we begin doing that, there are two other tasks that we must do before that. One is that we should apprise ourselves once again regarding why discussion on erroneous cognition occupies a kind of an important place, if not central place, in epistemology, as it's discussed in classical Indian philosophy. This is one, and then the other task that we must do is we must have a quick recapitulation of some of the issues discussed in the last lecture, so that we can connect it back to the discussion today. So first of all, again, let's discuss what is the epistemological importance, what is the philosophical importance of discussion on theories of error. As stated earlier, erroneous cognition raises some important issues regarding say, for example, the theories of perception. It raises certain issues for realism, for that matter, that some of the schools of Indian philosophy very strictly adhere to. How does it problematize some epistemological issues for them? One is that in a cognition that we later find to be erroneous, there is something definitely that is seen. So it is as stated earlier. It's not a judgment of the kind of doubt or sanshaya, where we are not sure about the nature of the object as we come across it. So there, the judgment is not, so to speak, categorical in nature. So there, there is a psychological element of not being sure about what is there before us. Whereas in erroneous cognition, we form a kind of a categorical judgment about something before us, like this is this is snake, or this is nacre, mother of pearl, or oyster shell, as we more commonly know it. So when we have some kind of a cognition, which later on turns out to be erroneous, we must explain the origin of a particular kind of cognition or mental content that somehow is created inside us. It's of course easier for an idealist position. Gives us a more easy posture, so to speak, to explain such kind of erroneous cognitions. But when it comes to a realist, it raises a kind of number of issues. So first of all, like how if the object that we form a judgment of, if it's not there before us, then how can its appearance be created? If something is not there before us, how can it happen that appearance of it it gets created in us? Now, there could be several alternatives. Somebody could say, like Nayayika, somebody could say, well, we happen to see something as a matter of some kind of an extrasensory perception. We happen to see something here and now, which is not here and now, but somewhere else. So their theory is called anyatha khyati, something which is elsewhere happens to be seen here and now. But again, there is a problem for a realist here, because something that's not here and now, we cannot account for what is called indriyartha sannikarsha, meaning we cannot account for sense-object contact in those cases. Now, of course, a realist of the Nyaya kind has devised a whole different way for it. So they say that there could be some kind of extra sensory perception, some kind of what is called a alaukic perception. But that's a special metaphysical device, and it's not so easy to give a kind of a sustainable argument for such kind of extrasensory perceptions. And also some of the other schools of thought are expressly against such kind of alleged possibilities. So, say for example, Mimamsakas, they would they are vehemently against any kind of yogic perception, any kind of perception where sense-object contact is not involved, because it kind of sort of goes against their very central concern, which is to preserve and to argue for the sanctity, or authority of the Vedic scriptures. So, if because according to them, as stated in the 4th sutra of Mimamsa Sutra, for them, a perception, cannot really account for some of the entities which, according to them, are real entities. Real, not in the not in the sense of material entities, but actual nevertheless. According to sort of as propounded by their metaphysics. So conceptions like apurva, adrashta, some unseen sort of power that is added to you after you perform a yajna. Apurva, something that was not there earlier, and now sort of comes into being. Which is designated as apurva by them. These are some of the things that don't lend themselves to perception. And that being the case, they explain it through some other means, because this is precisely where the authority of the word, the authority of the Vedas comes to the forefront before us. So Vedic scriptures are records of some of the experiences. They are they are kind of accounts which are accounts of things which cannot be proved, which cannot be demonstrated through perception, these are some of the things which don't lend themselves to perception, and this is precisely why we require some of the other sources of knowledge, like inference, and all these have to be indirect sources of knowledge, because perception cannot account for them, and perception would be a kind of some kind of immediate knowledge, which would involve some kind of a direct sense-object contact. So in this way, some philosophers like Mimamsakas would be vehemently against such kind of idea of extrasensory perception. And they would argue that things that like philosophical conceptions, metaphysical conceptions, metaphysical explanations, like the one offered by Naiyayikas for explaining erroneous cognition. These are some of the things that one shouldn't account for through perception. So such kind of sort of for such kind of metaphysical possibilities, we would rather resort to some of the other pramanas, indirect pramanas. and they have several of them, like inference, upamana, anumana, upamana, shabda, anupalabdhi, and arthapatti. So this way, error, the erroneous cognition brings to the fore, puts before us some of the very peculiar philosophical issues, like how to account for a particular cognition if there is nothing, if it doesn't match with the actual state of affairs, because there has to be a reason for that. If it is caused by the object before us, then how come there is a mismatch between what is seen and what is there? And if it is not caused by that object, then how come this such kind of a cognition happens to arise at all? So, say for example, to sort of simplify it for you. For example, if we see silver in place of nacre, then how come a piece of silver could produce cognition of nacre in us, could produce cognition of mother of pearl for us, and if it is said that like something that is elsewhere could produce that cognition in us, then that would defy reason, because that would mean things which are not there before our eyes at the moment could make their perceptions form in our mind, which doesn't really stand to reason. So this way, the problem here is that we'll have to explain it somehow. We also cannot say that the cognition concerned, the erroneous cognition concerned, arises out of nowhere, in the sense that there is nothing before us, as some of the theories we are discussing now, seem to state. Now, the problem there, as pointed out in the last lecture, would be that if it is nirvishaya, if it is without content, then how come, first of all, it has a definite character, of the kind this is a piece of silver, and second thing is, out of nothing can arise. Something sort of, this is more pertinent to theories like asat khyativad, which is generally ascribed to Shunyavadins. So if there is nothing before us, then there shouldn't be any perception, and let alone perception. Also, we are generally prompted to procure that object, in the sense that the cognition of an object prompts us into forming a further second order kind of a desire in us to either possess it or to shun an object, or to remain indifferent, as Naiyayikas sort of tell us. So an object which doesn't even exist, as pointed out by Asat-Khyatinvadis, then in that case, something, nothing cannot have the shunya, so to speak, asat, cannot have this potency to prompt us into some kind of activity. So there are, plethora of issues that come up. Like to explain the objective basis of an erroneous cognition, because there is a mismatch. It cannot be what it seems to be, and this mismatch needs to be explained, and one of the, there could be several ways of answering it, and we are looking at the moment some of the theories which would rather say, instead of explaining it somehow, how say for example something that is not there before us is able to cause an impression, a sense impression in us. Say for example, Naiyayikas make that kind of attempt. They would rather try to explain erroneous cognition by saying that something that's elsewhere for some, in some extrasensory way, happens to be presented before us here and now. So, there are sort of other kind of theories that we'll be discussing later on. One of them is Alaukik Khyativad, where the proponent would argue that something that is seen in an erroneous cognition, since it has to have an object, otherwise without an object some kind of cognition cannot be formed. And since there has to be a match between the thing seen and the actual thing. So they say that Alaukikvadins would say that object is actually created for a moment. So it so happens that for a moment something that is seen gets actually created in the locus, where later we find something else to be there. So some Jaina philosophers, especially some Jaina writers, especially ascribe it to some to a particular brand of Buddhist philosophers. If you want to keep your realism intact, then probably one way of wriggling out of such kind of an apparent impasse is that we somehow explain it by saying that something that's not here could possibly create a sense impression inside our mind, on our manas, or on our consciousness, or on ourself, or somebody might want to say, well, in a certain a Laukic way, in a certain sort of special metaphysical way, the thing happens to be produced. Yet another possibility could be something of the kind of Ramanuja's explanation. So Ramanuja, would rather say to keep, to preserve the realism that he adheres to. So he would rather say that since everything is composed of the same 5 elements, that are sort of Panchabhutas that we all know of. So since everything in the world is composed of the very same 5 Panchabhutas, so what we are mistaken about is not the thing, but but sort of the right proportion of the Panchabhutas. So since everything is composed of the same ingredients, same Panchabhutas, so that would mean everything is there in everything. So, possibility of everything is there in everything. So it's the same Brahman. It's just that Ramanuja, tries to fit the conception of Brahman within a realist framework and tries to make it, more plausible, more more kind of easier to understand. So he would rather explain, error like this, so that the overall realism of his theory remains intact. So he would say, well, when sort of we happen to see silver in mother of in the mother of pearl, then what happens is that it is actually there. It's actually there in part. So what happens is that we forget to see the other part, which actually constitutes the actual nature of oyster shell. And since we don't see it in its fullness, we don't see the right proportion of Panchabhutas, so we happen to sort of see something else which is also constituted by the same very Panchabhutas. So in a certain sense, like what happens here is that the sameness of everything is emphasized upon, which is the whole idea of non-dualism. There are no two things, but everything is ultimately is sort of of the kind of one. So that's the whole idea. It's just that he tries to fit it within realist framework, unlike Shankaracharya, who would who would rather try to sort of present his non-dualism, in a different ways. It's not that like he's more of an absolutist, but not so much of an idealist of the Berkeleyan variety. So now, having said that, now having understood why the study of theories of error is important, and what are the sort of epistemological issues that it raises before us. Now let's look at one of the theories that we were discussing in the last lecture, and the theory was Nirvishaya Khyativad. So as we would remember, the Nirvishaya Khyativad, basically the idea there is that what we see in an erroneous cognition actually lacks, so to speak, content. There is not much content to it. And we find its refutation, we find the discussion around it on, in a work by Venkatanath. So Venkatanath, who is a Vishisht Advaitin, criticizes the theory of Nirvishaya Khyativad on the grounds that the opponent has to define what is meant by Nirvishayata. It may mean the non-existence of the Vishay, that is cognitum, which would make it non-different from Asata Khyati. So if the proponent of Nirvishaya Khyativad states that Nirvishayata means the lack of existence of Vishaya, then it's no different from Asat Khyativad, which states that things do not have any essence of their own, things do not have any things are shunya, in the sense that they don't come along with a kind of name attached to them, with a label attached to them. So they lack any nature of their own. So any seeing as of something, according to them, would constitute kind of a khyati, because since things lack nature, things do not have a nature of their own, nothing is claiming to be so and so. Therefore, all cognitions are at par and are in a kind of a mismatch. They arise rather out of practical concerns than anything else. So what Venkatanath points out here is, if Nirvishayatva means shunyata of things, if it means the lack of Vishaya, cognitum, then it's not any different from Asat Khyati. Then why have another theory? Or alternatively, one might call it indescribable subsistence or mithyatva, something of a lie, something something that is untrue. So alternatively, one might call it indescribable subsistence, which would fling open the gates of anirvachaniya khyati. It may even mean the absence of Vishaya in the particular locus, in which case it would be non-different from Anyatha Khyati. So if it is pointed out that it is indescribable some sort of subsistence on something else, so there's something beneath it, which some kind of a substratum, and some kind of a mithyaropa, some kind of something else is projected onto it. In that case, it wouldn't be any different from Anirvachaniya Khyativad. If since it's indescribable, therefore we should call it Nirvishaya, because we cannot account for the Vishaya of it, how that content is generated. But if we believe that there is some kind of reality that it subsists upon, and which is indescribable, then this theory would not be any different from Anirvachaniya Khyati. And somebody might, if the proponent of Nirvishaya Khyativad say that it means the absence of Vishaya only in a particular locus. So basically, if they say that the matter, the problematic part of it is the locus, that sort of something, Vishaya is not there in the locus. But then it is not very far away from Anyatha Khyati. Then, a person who sort of subscribed to the Vishaya, to the theory of nirvishayata, wouldn't be stating anything apart from what is stated by the proponents of Anyatha Khyati. So, and only other alternative left with the opponent in that case is to state that no object appears in an invalid cognition. But that would be a contradiction insofar as it is cognition of silver, which means that silver appears in perception. How can there be a cognition of silver though no silver appears in it? Thus, this theory stands self-condemned. So Venkatanath, says that the only alternative, now sort of that is left with the opponent is that he or she could state that there is no appearance at all. There is no object appearing before us in a case of Khyati. But that's not true because, as stated earlier, in any case of Khyati, there is a categorical judgment, that we form in our mind. The judgment is very much categorical, in nature. It's either of the form of is or is not or whatever. Like I say, solve the form of is, not of is not. So it's categorical in nature, and it clearly sort of comes along with a sense of some object that is perceived. So such kind of position where somebody states that in invalid cognition no object appears, that would be sort of clearly untrue. This position doesn't hold water because we know that judgment is always, even in an erroneous cognition, judgment is pretty much categorical in nature. Like in that case, the judgment should be of the form I see nothing but it has an appearance of something like this. So which would be again contradiction. So this way, since we cannot really, there can be no coherent, plausible, valid explanation of what is called, what has been stated as nirvishayatva, lack of, vishaya, in an erroneous perceptual judgment, since no sort of plausible explanation can be given of what it means for which is stated as the lack of Vishaya. Therefore, this theory stands self-condemned because there can be no coherent explanation for it. Now, further on, Venkatanath in his Sarvartha Siddhi suggests that this theory was upheld by a Buddhist school in 30th shlokas of his of this work. In the 4th chapter called Buddhisar, he states that now are being refuted the different views but put forward by the Buddhists accepting extra mental reality. Further he states, now the author presents Niradhisthana Khyati as advanced by certain Buddhists accepting extra mental reality. So now we would shift our attention from Nirvishaya Khyati to what is known as Niradhisthana Khyati. There is a very subtle difference between the two, about which like we will sort of talk in a moment from now. But both these theories are variously sort of ascribed to different to Buddhists belonging to different schools. So Venkatanath tells us gives an account of yet another kind of Khyati, which is known as Niradhisthana Khyati. So above lends a lot of credibility to the view that it was presented by a Buddhist school of philosopher. The theory has been presented as follows. Advocates of different theories of error are constrained to accept in the ultimate analysis either the akhyati view of Prabhakara or anyatha khyati. The former will lead to a denial of cognition itself insofar as it denies any objective basis for error, and the later will bring in its wake asat khyati because the subject of cognition is not here and now. So to avoid these two unwelcome contingencies, some advocate the theory of nirvishaya khyati following the maxim of the eyes being fixed upon something other than what appears in cognition. The term for that is anya sakta drishtinyaya. Anya sakta drishtinyaya. So the point here is that when we talk about nirvishaya khyati, we are basically challenging the vishayatva, the very content of the erroneous cognition. But in nirdishtan khyati, and as pointed out earlier, as explained earlier, nirvishaya khyati could either be reduced to asat khyati or to anyatha khyati. Therefore, some other kind of explanation has to be devised, by Buddhists who sort of otherwise, hold nirvishaya khyati, and that other, possibility could be, sort of explaining it in terms of, in terms of not having an underlying basis. So the main point in Niradhisthana khyati is that here, you're not bringing into question the very content of perception, but what you are bringing into question is the underlying substratum. So what you are stating is that there is no underlying substratum, in an erroneous cognition, and sort of one could further go from here and state that there is no adhishtan, there is no underlying substratum of any cognition whatsoever. So the point here is that since there is no underlying substratum at all, therefore there is no point of having to match our cognition with something out there. So the reference point, if you could somehow remove the reference point altogether, then it might seem to us that the problem of erroneous cognition, could be solved. So, the point here is that error becomes error vis-a-vis the object that is perceived, the actual nature of the object that is perceived. So, error arises because there is some kind of incongruence, there is some kind of incoherence between our judgment and a later sublating, perception where we come to know the actual nature of the thing. So, but so there is an actual reference point, namely reality, that is, that becomes known to us later on. But if that reference point is altogether done away with, then probably the problem that we are confronting here, the ontological and epistemological problem that we face here, could be solved. So one could argue that there is no adhisthana at all, and therefore the appearance of something almost kinds of comes out of nowhere. So Venkatanatha criticizes the theory of nirvishaya, for that matter any such kind of a vishaya, because this would in a certain way apply to other such theories as well. So Venkatanatha criticizes this view by pointing out that it is deficient insofar as it explains neither origin nor sublation of error, nor does it explain the behavior of the knower towards the object. So nirvishayatva explains nothing. It doesn't explain the origin, because there has to be some real cause to explain the origin of an erroneous cognition, and that's not done in nirvishaya khyativad. Nor does it explain the sublation of error, and nor does it even explain, as pointed out earlier, our behavior, because we happen to see something, and sort of and form a particular judgment, and that judgment prompts us. So there is, the judgment, the seeing of something has some kind of response from us. So that response is also not explained, by such theories. If the nirvishayata means absence of the cognitum in the locus in question, or appears as a savishaya, then it is no different from manyata khyati. If, however, the nirvishaya appears as such an experience, it can prompt no activity at all. So this is another sort of dilemma that Venkatanath poses before the sort of upholders of this theory, that if nirvishayata means absence of cognitum or appears as savishaya, if something that is nirvishaya appears as savishaya, then it is not different from anyatha khyati. And if nirvishaya appears as such, if nirvishaya appears as nirvishaya only, then something which is without a vishay, which doesn't have any mental content, if there is a perception which does not have any mental content, that wouldn't prompt us into activity. Say, for example, if we close our eyes and there is no mental content before us, such kind of lack of mental content, nirvishayata, wouldn't prompt us into any kind of activity. So nirvishayata does not explain any of such things. If nirvishayata means stark absence, the theory becomes reduced to asat khyati. If nirvishaya means cognition having no sense datum, then in that case it can only explain cases of hallucination and not illusions. So finally, if nirvishaya means a cognition which has no sense datum, in the sense of like the way a representationist would think of sense datum, sense datum as coming from somewhere and causing, as some kind of a something that causes the perception in us, so sense datum in that sense, then in that case it can only explain hallucinations, something that is seen without there being anything at all. So people at times have hallucinations. The sense of the world is almost lost to them. Dream sequence could be another such case. So this such theories could be useful device for explaining dreams, or hallucinations, but not illusions. Not illusions of the kind where something is seen but doesn't match the actual state of affairs. So now coming over to niradhishthan khyati, the term of the meaning of the term adhishthan has already been explained. It basically means some kind of an underlying substratum upon which something else happens to be projected. So some kind of because even if we want to say, for example, even in the case of watching a film, there we require some kind of a proper screen where we could project a film. It requires some kind of a substratum or some kind of a ground where something which is not which is which is not material in nature, which is that could be projected. So there's some adhishthan is required. So this is generally what we would mean by adhishthan, substratum, which is a requisite for for any kind of appearance to be projected at all. Something cannot be projected in a thin air, especially in the cases of illusion, especially in the cases of it's only something that is seen as something else, but something has to be there. So some substratum has to be there. So, as far as this theory is concerned, while according to Nyaya-sar, it is a theory upheld by the Madhyamikas or the Shunyavadins, the Sarvartha Siddhi commentary attributes it to a school of Buddhist realists. So, not to Shunyavadins, but later schools of Buddhist realists. All errors, according to this theory, superimpose sheer imagination of something upon, nothing at all, since there is no adhisthana. Therefore, errors are, comprised of superimposition of some sheer imagination upon something, something like, something which is without any substratum. It does not mean to say that once error is sublated, we realize that there is nothing underneath as substratum. So the idea here is not that, first we form an erroneous cognition, like there is a snake over there, and then, later on we realize that it's not snake but a rope. So, like a sublating kind of a later judgment. It's not that later on, say for example, in cases of hallucination would have better explain it. When we come out of hallucination or when we come out of dream, we realize that this was like completely some kind of something that didn't have any objective basis at all. So it's not something of this kind. Rather, the import of this theory is that there is no locus of the appearance in error, and therefore to explain it in terms of superimposition of any kind does not even arise. So, according to this theory, appearances do not have any locus at all. Appearances arise not out of definite loci, and therefore one cannot explain it in terms of superimposition of something onto some substratum. This theory attacks the very idea of some support which makes the externalization or localization of content of an invalid cognition within the mind or outside of it. So this theory Niradhisthana Khyati attacks the very idea that there has to be some support through which certain kind of imagination, some kind of seeing which happens internally happens to be externalized. Or happens to be localized, say for example, mere seeing of green is something else, but if that green is projected onto a specific location, then it some kind of a categorical judgment arises. But that requires something, some kind of a locus where that kind of seeing could be externalized. So, this theory attacks the very idea of some support which makes the externalization or localization of the content of an invalid cognition within the mind or outside of it. Nyaya Siddhijnana of Nyaya Siddhanjana of Venkata records an endeavor of proving non-locative presentation by means of the following inference. So he states there, Venkata states there, all cognitions like perception etc. are without any substratum in as much as they are cognitions just like cognitions in the dream. So as pointed out, dream sequence would be a better explanation for it. So the Sanskrit version of it is pratyakshadi pratyayo niralambanaha pratyatvat swapna pratyayavat. This is from Nyaya-sar. So just like in the case of swapna, there is no substratum there. There is though nothing out there on which something is projected. Therefore, cases of error are just like that. It does not necessarily require any substratum, any adhisthana, and this is how the onus of explaining the error through some substratum upon which something else is projected, this question does not even arise. This argument, the argument just stated from as given by Venkata, could be easily ascribed to Buddhist idealist and precludes the possibility of distinction between valid and invalid cognitions from any objective standpoint, since there is none. So as we can see, this argument, one could more plausibly ascribe to a Buddhist idealist. But in such cases, the very distinction between valid and invalid cognition, in a certain way, would go. We wouldn't have any basis to differentiate between valid and invalid cognition, maybe except in terms of practical utility. But from the point of view, from pure phenomenal point of view, there may not be any distinction between valid and invalid cognitions. So the difference between nirvishaya khyati and this theory, namely niradhisthana khyati, is that while the latter focuses on the content of the error as being absent, the former argues for the substratum being absent and also denies the operation of any mental projection in such cognitions. So something that's already been explained. So on this account, further on, there is no external factor that occasions an erroneous cognition. So since there's no substratum is there, so there is no external factor which would occasion, which would work as as causally efficacious in producing an erroneous cognition. So in other words, there is no alamban pratyaya. So this word alamban pratyaya is used by the famous Buddhist logician, namely Dignaga. He uses the term alamban, in a certain sense, and he has this his famous text that is ascribed to him, namely Alamban Pariksha. So as Dignaga would they have no Alamban Pratyaya, as Dignaga would call it. They are mere aberrations. So erroneous cognitions are mere aberrations that occur in the consciousness without any external agent. We have an appearance of some kind of entangled, example of something like this would be, we have an appearance of some kind of an entangled mass of hair and the like when we close our eyes. Needless to say that such a perception has no underlying substratum, or it would have been common to both the erroneous cognition as well as sublating cognition. So just to give an example of how a certain some kind of a seeing could be there without there being any substratum. I mean, one example could be when we close our eyes, we have we see some kind of heavy woolly mass of black or something like that, as if there's some kind of an entangled mass of hair, because hair in the sense hair thinking that we are talking about black hair here. So this is the kind of appearance we have before us, but this appearance, the phenomenal character of it, this appearance has a phenomenal character, insofar as it involves seeing, but it arises out of nowhere. There is no adhisthana behind it. To differentiate it from smriti pradosha or akhyati of Prabhakaras, because Prabhakaras also say that there is so to speak no erroneous cognition at all. So here also we are when we say such cognitions lack any adhishtan, somebody might mean it to say that no error in such cases should be supposed to be taking place at all. So to differentiate it from that kind of a theory, it is pointed out that such cognitions are characterized by certain thisness, whereas remembrance is characterized by thatness. So if like Prabhakara's, we want to account for something that seems to appear before our eyes, like when we close our eyes, the kind of mass of entangled mass of hair that we see, if we say that this is because of smriti pradosha, something that we have seen in the past, we think that we are seeing it here and now, that doesn't stand to reason, because the cases of error are of the kind, this is a piece of silver, not that was a piece of silver. So since they are always of the kind of this something being there, it is characterized by thisness and hairness, something being here and now, and as characterized by the word this. Therefore, any account from memory doesn't seem to sufficiently account for it. Now, the refutation of it, as offered in Nyaya Parishuddhi and Nyaya Sar, is the authors of these texts equate it with the Asat-Khyati theory and ask, doesn't the object in question, irrespective of its veracity, appear as being here? In other words, all objects are perceived inevitably along with some stipulated spatio-temporal coordinates. If the proponent agrees that errors come along with some sense of location, then they have to also concede that spatiotemporality as the mark of adhisthana of the character. So since all cognitions have this sense of spatiotemporality, which is characteristic of adhisthana. So if the proponent of this theory agrees that spatiotemporality, as pointed out by Kant also, where this is called as pure intuition, so if spatiotemporality is there, then that's good account of adhisthana. If the proponent of this theory denies that hairness indicated by the word this, then he denies the erroneous cognition itself, since it is undeniably characterized by it. If somebody says that something is being seen without any spatio-temporal coordinates, then that's not true, because any judgment, as pointed out by Kant also, involves, becomes possible only in the background of spatio-temporal framework provided by the sense of time and space. Further, if one denies the ground of cognition, then one concedes the possibility of erroneous cognition being everywhere. So when we see a mass of hair, it is the darkness within the eyeball that is the cause of this perception. So if seeing of something dark when we close our eyes is characterized as something without as an example of some seeing of something without any substratum, then it wouldn't be true, because seeing of such kind of mass of hair could be explained as lack of light reaching our eyeball. So it can be explained that lack of light reaching our eyeball, because we have closed our eyelids, that can be explained as the cause of perception here, instead of saying that this would be an example of a lack of adhisthana, lack of substratum. Thus, even though the lack of content or lack of substratum could be a logical possible attempt to explain error, it does not fit well with certain other empirical requirements or certain other empirical dimensions of the erroneous cognition, leading to its implausibility. So this way we see that niradhisthana khyati, which is not really very far away from nirvishaya khyativad, but still sort of the difference has already been explained, but we find that niradhisthana khyati also sort of does not sufficiently explain us the occurrence of error on on all sort of ontological and epistemological grounds. So, friends, this is all we have time for. We'll continue our discussion and have a discussion on other theories like Alaukik Khyativad and so on in our lectures to come. Thank you.